all for being here. My name is Budwey, and I am the Director of Research for the Loepp Society. And welcome to all of you. This is the Emerging Scholars Forum. And we want to thank Mykayla at HS for sponsoring this session in honor of Paul A. Richardson at HS, author of the Loepp Society Centennial History and reigning monarch of research. Pretty good title for that. I saw them here. Where is our reigning monarch? We bow to you, our reigning monarch. All right. So, just to give you a little bit of background, each year we encourage current graduate students and those who have graduated within the past 3 years to submit proposals to present their original, unpublished research on congregational song. This year we have 3 excellent scholars with us. We have Lisa Clark, a PhD candidate at the University of Bristol, Anneli, Thiessen, a PhD candidate at the University of Ottawa, and Mykayla Turner, a Master of Sacred Music candidate at Perkins School of Theology. Each presenter will have 15 minutes to give their presentation, followed by 5 minutes for questions. I'm going to have the handheld mic, and because the session is being recorded, if you can raise your hand, I'll bring the mic to you so you can use the mic to present your question. So now, I'm delighted to welcome our first presenter, Lisa Clark.
I'd like to thank the Loepp Society for this incredible opportunity, as well as the committee for the Emerging Scholars Forum. It's a huge honor to do this, especially with my fellow researchers. We've already had some bonding, which has been great over some techniques. One small note I would like to make, there is a handout in your app. If your device is too small to see scores, you may want to take a handout. I have them on either side. It's not a rush. You won't need those until a little bit later. But I just want to mention that just in case. All right. As of course you heard, my name is Lisa. I am studying at the University of Bristol, and part of my research that pertains to Trinity as a hymn writer has to do with eschatology, study the end and times. And so I was so excited when I saw this theme of seeing the world God imagines, because in my mind there is a lot of interplay there as far as my research is going and some of our focus that we've got here on this. So when we think about the world that God imagines and seeing the world that God imagines, our theme for this conference presupposes 2 things. 1, God does imagine the world to be a certain way, and 2, the world today, at least to some degree, is different from that. Because after all, if God doesn't have necessarily in the world, then we don't need to really consider it, or if we're already there, then there's really no way to spend any time in the context for it. So, when we speak about the world that God imagines, we think about God's end goal, the divine goal of what God wants for us, and all that God has in mind for the goal. And so God's end goal is the world God imagines. Eschatology, the study of the end, is the study of God's end, the goal of a divinely imagined world. About 100 years ago, Albert Schweitzer pointed out that Jesus was constantly referencing the kingdom of God, an eschatological concept, and therefore his mission was largely eschatological. Therefore, as Jesus proclaimed that the kingdom of God is at hand, if we want to consider Christology, we also need to consider eschatology. As a result, and not only just Schweitzer, but others along with him, there were a huge boom of interest in eschatology in the past 100 years. When I'm researching eschatology, one of the things that really impacted me as someone who's a hymn writer and hymn seer is the thought of eschatological ethic. The end that we have in mind influences the means toward that end. Our picture of the world God imagines influences what we do in the meantime. Therefore, our ethic is influenced by the world God imagines as we consider it. What we choose to sing is influenced by our eschatological ethic. And our eschatological ethic, of course, I don't have to convince any of you, is influenced by the songs we sing. That our songs influence what we think and do. So, I'd like to talk today about 3 approaches to eschatological ethic. Heaven on earth Heaven is my home. I knew heaven and earth. Now I do have some caveats, of course, that I research it does. One is not an exhaustive list, and there's certainly many different nuances that we need to consider, and no one's going to fit perfectly in a cookie cutter eschatological ethic. Neither will any opinion necessarily either. Also, I think that it's important to note that not necessarily any church body fits into a particular eschatological ethic. Even church bodies that are quite united in doctrine may actually display different approaches to eschatological ethic in practice. Finally, I know these terms are kind of cutesy. They're a little cliche. When I've been researching, I've noticed a lot of scholars talk about eschatological ethic. And they try to describe different approaches, but none of them that I have seen them use anything consistent, and therefore, I've been using these phrases lately. I think they're kind of fun, at least for our purposes today. They should help serve the discussion. So, heaven on earth, what does that mean? The heaven on earth eschatological ethic focuses on how humanity can make today as perfect as possible, in contrast, perhaps, to how God would impact humanity in the future. This can manifest in excellent progress toward issues related to the environment, social justice, oppression, poverty, and the like, and really active change now. So the emphasis may not necessarily be on the future. There are a variety of reasons for that we don't necessarily have time to delve into today. But I think that there are many who want to prioritize the here and now to make God's world as God imagines come as soon and as quickly and as tangibly as possible. One example, and I'm going to ask Dr. Mykayla to come up because we are going to be seeing some examples. This is right at the 9th page of handouts. Is let there be peace on earth. And is it possible to see the second half of that? Or okay. So on your handout, if you don't mind starting right in the middle, where let peace begin with you. Heaven is my home is the next eschatological ethic I'd like to address. And a simple way to try to summarize this is Jesus died to save us from our sins and we will be in heaven someday. So the first one would be the focus is on God's work of salvation, but more of a personal rescue rather than cosmic deliverance. The end is not looking toward a new world so much as leading this world to be with God. And so this eschatological ethic is going to be a lot more personal, not necessarily considering the community and thinking about the world, the future of the person, not necessarily the future of everyone. The example I'd like to use is actually the hymn that I stole this phrase from, but it's at home, is I'm not a stranger here. If we could sing the second stanza of that one. yearns to leave this world, the desert of the world. It's key to know the context, of course. This particular song was written by one who was close to death, so immediate deliverance from suffering was a comfort. But as you look at the text, it seems there's passive, waiting for the bliss of a new world, and eagerly waiting to depart this world. There is a comfort in the world for those who are looking toward an end and suffering and an end of life. However, taken out of context, this hymn can appear to neglect the Christian call to the world today. No hymn, of course, can address the whole counsel of God in these stanzas, but without other hymns to supplement, some may be tempted to use Coming Home as a justification for just looking up personally and personal. New heaven and new earth is the third eschatological ethic that I am presenting, and I propose that this ethic seeks to unite the best of both worlds. The best of the eschatological ethics, but also the best of both worlds when you're talking about heaven and earth, and new heaven and earth as well. This ethic is often characterized by the phrase now, not yet, with a both and tension of present and eternity and of God and humanity. That there is work to be done now, but work will be completed in the future. That God will be bringing about the world that God imagines, but that also God uses humanity now in that work. The kingdom of God is at hand, has begun, and is continuing and will be completed. And therefore, we have this third section, the kingdom of God, where God is present and where God's will is done, is a dynamic concept that Jesus ushered in the kingdom of God, which will one day be complete when God makes all things new. So you see how this particular one can give a reason for doing something now, but also not exhaustion or despair when the world that God imagines is not immediate. But it also, again, reminds humanity, us at the church, that while God is at work, so is the church. The example that I'm going to use is a relatively new one, and so again, we'll be looking at this one. Your Kingdom of God is a glorious treasure by David Wagner, and we'll do the second sentence. So we see in the first stanza of this hymn, the kingdom of God is priceless. This is actually a hymn that addresses three parables from Matthew 13, but presents them actually in opposite order. So the first stanza looks at the priceless pearl of the kingdom of God. But the second stanza really has a lot of the eschatological ethic that I'm referencing. God is in charge of this kingdom and enables the singer to work in it, empowered by the word and spirit. And this hymn does not end with the singer dying or ending with the end of the person the singer's life, but when Jesus returns and all is perfect and complete, the resurrection of the dead and the life of the world to come. Now, one of the things that I just talked about is how eschatological ethic impacts many things, whether we necessarily realize it all the time or not, which is, again, one of my goals, that we think about this more. I've used three examples that are pretty clear and directly related to eschatological ethic. Now, I do want to make sure that I make a point that none of these hymns are necessarily written with that intention, and that some of the writers may not necessarily subscribe to a particular eschatological ethic. They're looking at content, those themes are coming out. So what would happen, for example, if we looked at a hymnal category of redemption or redeemer? And a hymn that reflects the theme heaven on earth approach, I portray Jesus as the one who lifts up the lowly and brings marginalized into a place of love. A call to action within the hymn text would be that the singers should be instruments of peace and healing toward the hurting world. Humans will likely be active agents in the context to bring about a better scenario now, but the hymn is not likely to focus on the divine event in the future as Jesus is a redeemer to pay for individual sins. A hymn in the category Heaven is My Home is likely to focus on Jesus Christ on the cross and the sacrifice to redeem the sinner, paying for the individual sin, and promising peaceful and divine rest after death. Singers are not likely to be portrayed as active redemption agents, but rather passive recipients of forgiveness and heavenly love. A hymn text that reflects the new heaven and new earth approach might portray Jesus as the redeemer of all things in a cosmic undertaking to remake and restore all of creation. The heaven and earth are two entities that will be unified, and God and humanity and all of creation will be reconciled. The call to action this hymn will likely utilize a both and approach, because God has inaugurated the kingdom of God in the blood of Jesus. All who are called to participate in the kingdom of God within the work of restoration and reconciliation now as a foretaste of all that will come. Now, I do have some suggestions and some hints here, but actually that's homework. If you'd like to take a look and see if what you think as far as how this do or don't fit, I can have you share my slides. An Advent hymn that uses the heaven on earth approach is likely to echo a lament for the birthplace that continues in this world. It may also include a prayer to inspire singers to bring about peace coming down in Christmas New Year, this for example, so that future Advent or Christmas will truly see a fulfilled and complete peace among humanity and with the earth. An Advent hymn that reflects heaven is my home as the eschatological ethic will point to Jesus, the Son of God, who brought peace to earth on Christmas, and who brings peace to all one day who live with him forever. An Advent hymn that reflects the new heaven and new earth approach will likely emphasize the incarnation of God in Jesus to reaffirm the cosmic significance of the divine claiming creation and the material as good, foreshadowing the future reunion of God with all created things. The longing of the first Advent will parallel the longing for the second coming, when Jesus will return to restore creation, unify humans, creation, and God together in complete love and perfection. The end. I couldn't call myself that. I think one of the purposes that I have in bringing these conversations up is really for dialogue and for better articulation as to some of the choices that we make. So those who select hymns for worship or for hymnals can be mindful of the eschatological ethic promoted in a given text. Those who write hymns, such as myself, can consider the scope of content and ethic articulated in their work. And finally, all years of church song can use its eschatological awareness to enhance dialogue among one another as we each consider and sing the world God imagines. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Any questions?
This hope for heaven, being united with God, is that strictly speaking eschatology? I think of eschatology as end times, or the renewal of heaven.
Sure. Great question. Because I'm a PhD student right now, I would say define heaven and define eschatology. If heaven is where God is, which is kind of the definition I've been using in my own research, that becomes much broader as far as not necessarily believing. And also the concept of inaugurated eschatology, that if Jesus did indeed usher in the kingdom of God and the work of the church right now is to continue that work, then eschatology is also now. So that now, not yet tension comes into play. I hope that addressed your question.
Thanks for your presentation. I was wondering, just based on the examples here, I'm starting to develop some idea of, for some senses, you look at time periods in relation to different eschatological schools. But I wonder if you could speak a little bit more about any broad themes you may have noticed for different time periods and contexts.
Very perceptive. Yeah, so I have limited my research as narrowly as possible to the past century or so because of the eschatological boom. Now, I have also said in other places in my research that yes, there are certainly themes throughout the past 2,000 years and before. And so there are some great hymns that I wanted to present and didn't, and then also some eschatological themes that would have been interesting. But for my particular research, I'm kind of trying to keep it as best as I can in the past century. So that's why it's limited.
Thank you so much.
Thank you all for your patience as we play musical laptops, but we welcome our next presenter, Anneli, please.
In late 2019, I was scrolling through Instagram, watching videos of a prayer rally at Bethel Church in California. I observed as worship leaders led a song I had not heard before, one that talked about a way-making, miracle-working, promise-keeping God. The song was catchy, the lyrics were compelling. I searched Waymaker in Apple Music and on YouTube, and downloaded the first song that came up. It was a recording of the song by the American worship band Light. I watched as other ensembles cover the song, including Mykayla, Smith, and Passion. For months, I listened to the song, believing that Leland was right there. In spring 2020, again on Instagram, I saw a post about the #1 Christian songwriter on Loepp. It was a name I did not recognize. It was an actually forward. Already attuned to the gender and racial imbalances of the Christian music industry, I was surprised to see a name I didn't know, and particularly one that appeared to not be a Western European or Euro-American name. I googled Thiessen name and was shocked to see that she was the songwriter behind Waymaker. I learned that Sanach, the artist's stage name, is an award-winning songwriter and vocalist. She's recorded 9 albums and serves as an international worship leader at her home church, Christ Embassy Local. She lives in Lagos, Nigeria, with her husband and young child. She's written many hit worship songs that are sung around the world, and particularly outside of North America. For Waymaker, she was a solo songwriter. She hadn't collaborated with Leland or any other North American worship leader. She wrote the song from her home in Nigeria, and the song then made its way to North America. And yet, she received little to no acknowledgement. In the hymnody circles in which I knew, a powerful song from another culture would be celebrated with a gift, and the song would be contextualized and cared for as an intercultural experience. But for Waymaker in the contemporary worship world, it appeared that no one knew or cared for its intercultural origins. My experience listening to Waymaker is like thousands of other white North American Christians. I did not realize that I was listening to a song that was coming to us as a gift from another culture. I did not realize that a Black woman was credited. I did not realize that the popularity of Waymaker marked something special happening in the contemporary worship scene in North America. The level of success that Waymaker reached as an award-winning, but particularly for Sanach, a Black female songwriter from Nigeria who succeeded in a dominantly white male North American industry.
North American evangelicals, white North American evangelicals, primarily sing worship music written by collaboration between white American men. This paper seeks to highlight Sinach's Waymaker as an exception to the rule. In an industry that is so consistently dominated by American men, the emergence of a song by a solo Nigerian woman is certainly cause for celebration. But it also should cause us to ask some questions. How do white evangelical North Americans encounter worship music from cultures beyond their own? What practices should they adopt when learning, teaching, and singing music? How can we respect community origins when they are not our own? Before continuing, I want to name my identity as a white North American woman and acknowledge that there are facets of conversation on cultural appropriation and worship that I should not attempt to address. In this case, however, I believe it is the responsibility of white people to name what our practices have fallen short and to consider how we can work to be more respectful of music and worship practices from different cultures. This is not work that people of color can or should do on behalf of white people. It must be done thoughtfully and intentionally by white people. Some of the practices and studies of Christian church music, there are protocols, resources, and common practices for engaging songs from around the world, which are often referred to as global songs, a term that needs to be consistent with the literature. When teaching global songs, practitioners make a point of building connections with the song's context of origin, highlighting the story behind the song for a congregation, and then carefully crafting the musical accompaniment so as to avoid appropriation. There are certain musical and linguistic features that many associate with global songs, with popular examples including a song like Siyahamba We Are Marching, which is a South African traditional for sun and sunshine. The classification of global songs evidenced by musical features commonly associated with the song's geographic origins, and especially associated with languages beyond English. Sinach's Waymaker, by contrast, was written in English and follows the verse-chorus bridge structure of much popular music. In many ways, it does not sound like what many associate with global songs, and the practices of global song leaders did not influence contemporary worship's approach. The fault is not only on contemporary worship leaders, however. Global song practitioners largely ignored the song as it did not fit with expectations of how the global song sounds. They could have adopted Waymaker as an intercultural resource, yet most did not. This is an example of how global music in North American Christian congregational singing has been vetted or even colonized by white people to determine what counts as global music and what does not. Musical features that are traditional to non-Western cultures have been upheld as trademarks for global music, and songs with these features have been romanticized. For the first several months of singing Waymaker, white North American Christians mistakenly overlooked its origins. Now, after several years of popularity, the song winning several awards, more people are able to recognize that the song comes from Nigeria. But Waymaker has already peaked, and the moment has passed. This paper suggests ways for white evangelical North American congregations to better honor intercultural worship songs in the future. Kimberly Crenshaw's feminist intersectional theory provides a framework for the special consideration that must be given to Sinach's Waymaker and other contemporary worship songs around the world. Intersectionality is defined as the overlapping of social problems, such as sexism and racism, to create multiple levels of social injustice that cannot be fully explained through only one lens. Within music industries, women of color face unique obstacles as they're marginalized at the intersections of both race and gender, a compounding challenge not faced by white women or men of color. For Christian songwriting communities, it is injustice every time the identity of a songwriter is overlooked, as it perpetuates inequality. Some in worship leadership receive credit, others do not. For Sinach, the compounding of her identities of Black Nigerian female solo songwriters means that overlooked authorship has multiple levels of injustice. Within congregational song classifications and output, there are exciting intersections between contemporary worship music and global song. However, when these genres intersect in mainstream white evangelical repertoire, it is usually contemporary worship music from North America that infiltrates communities in other parts of the world, and not vice versa. The reason that Sinach's Waymaker is so exceptional is that it's an example of a global song impacting the genre of contemporary worship music in North America. While the global south is the growing edge of Pentecostalism and other evangelical worship expressions, Ingalls highlights that Pentecostalism's population center is not yet determined as the center of influence in the marketplace of ideas and products. North soon known in the broader Pentecostal imaginary. Worship practices are still firmly rooted in the North American center, despite the global spread of Pentecostalism and music. Loepp has written about the intersections between global song and contemporary worship music, especially in his 2020 article, Nashville and Sydney Are Not So Walls, exploring the ways that contemporary worship music emerges in global communities and non-Euro-American communities in North America, specifically highlighting the emergence of Chinese contemporary worship music. However, there is little to note on the way contemporary worship music's global development impacts white North American communities. For example, contemporary worship music emerging in China impacts Chinese American congregations, but these songs have not infiltrated mainstream contemporary worship sets for white evangelical congregations. So based on these observations, this graphic describes how different parties influence each other within a contemporary worship music industry. You'll notice that as Loepp suggests, non-Euro-American communities in North America and global communities both influence each other, and the white North American worship music industry influences both of these communities. However, neither of these communities influence the mainstream white North American evangelical worship music industry. The CCLI lists reflect this trend. If they are a reflection of top North American contemporary worship songs, they have not been affected by the influences outside of North America or by non-Euro-American communities within North America. The homogeneous nature of the contemporary worship music industry has led to a practice of introducing and adopting songs that do not consider race, gender, ethnicity, or geographic origin. This falls in line with a long and problematic history of white artists covering music by Black artists and claiming it as their own. While white artists benefited from these covers, Bush Maltsby highlights that the practices of the segregated music industry led to limited exposure for African American artists. The example of Sinach's Waymaker and Covered by Leland is an example of this injustice in the contemporary worship music industry. So with the hope that evangelicals will continue to worship with songs who are outside of their own context, what follows are suggestions for how to engage contemporary worship music that emerges from global context in an ethical way. I don't intend for these suggestions to be an exhaustive protocol, but rather a starting place for conversation and establishing best practice. So when learning a song from another part of the world, a first foundational step is determining whether you have or can obtain copyright permission to perform the song. In the case of Waymaker, copyright for the song became available via Christian Copyright Licensing International, CCLI. However, CCLI is very North American dominant and does not necessarily house copyright for other songs from around the world, particularly if they haven't yet reached popularity in North America. If CCLI does not carry copyright for the song, worship leaders and administrators will need to seek permission directly from as close to the source as possible. Next, we need to care for relationships. Worship leaders must consider how or whether their use of the song cares for the songwriter and community of origin. Attentiveness to various positions of power present in congregational song is one way of expressing care. Nathan Myrick suggests that congregational music is unethical when it is uncaring. In order for congregational music to be performed in a caring manner, the relational needs of those involved must be attended to. This can be done by asking questions that interrogate power imbalances. Is this performance of Waymaker, for example, provide agency to Sinach as songwriter? Have we considered the power we hold as worship leaders, particularly if we lead mega churches of thousands of people or have a large social media following? Is this performance oriented toward the best case for the songwriter and community of origin, or the best case for our worship leadership? Next, it is essential that the songwriter and context of origin are appropriately acknowledged. In churches that use hymnals, the text writer and composer are usually listed at the bottom of the page, providing clear credit. In contemporary worship music, of course, or in contemporary worship, hymnals are rarely used, and recognition of songwriters may be missing. Some communities list songwriters and copyright information on the first slide of projected lyrics, but this isn't always legible and often leaves pretty students at the moment of the song. In worship, listing the name of the songwriter and any relevant media and making sure that it doesn't appear as though someone else wrote the song should be a minimum. For Leland's music video that we saw a snapshot of at the beginning, Sinach's name should appear on the screen alongside that before the end. Finally, the song must be appropriately contextualized in corporate worship. In her article in Global Song Transmission, Marissa Gladius-Moore describes some of the ways that global songs can be treated in order to respect their origins. She writes, the key pieces of information that global song leaders seek are who the people are, how their songs are used or conceived, and what they stand for. As much of this information as possible is then included in worship to appropriately contextualize the music for a congregation. Unfortunately, none of the three pieces of information that Lydia's board highlights have been regularly incorporated into performances of Sinatra's Waymaker. Performances of the song from groups like Leland prominently display the absence of these principles from performance. Even within the context of worship that emphasizes the need for flow, there are ways to effectively contextualize songs without interrupting the flow of worship. For Waymaker, worship leaders could say something like the following. This morning we want to sing a new song together, one that comes to us from Nigeria. It's written by an artist named Anneli, who's a really powerful music ministry at her home church in Lagos. We've been able to watch her sing this song online. She has a really powerful music video that I encourage you all to watch. The song is such a testament to who God is as a waymaker, miracle worker, promise keeper. Let's sing together. This kind of introduction can contextualize the song for the congregation, giving appropriate recognition of the song's origins. What these steps reveal is that the work of adopting a worship song with global origins is not easy, nor is it simple. Doing this well involves recognizing intersectional identities in worship, which is a response to the gospel's call to love our neighbors. I want to end with a quote from Finn Shaw. Intersectional Christians see commitment to intersectional thinking as a tool to help them embody the gospel's call to love our neighbors, to love our enemies, and to do good to all. Intersectionality becomes a practice that attunes us to our neighbors' needs and helps us see our neighbors, even those who differ from us, as full human beings, to love their God and our siblings in God's family. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Questions?
Thank you for your presentation. I have two questions. The first is, I don't know, if she was also financially recognized by the world. I think this also with the industry. And the second question would be, how musically if the song was changed when incorporated by the American market? It had Thiessen and here
Yeah, those are two excellent questions. Thank you. So the first one, she did receive financial compensation, but there's always a bit of a breakdown in terms of, it's a complicated question. She did receive financial compensation, and I've seen people say she got paid. That's all that we need to care about. And to me, that's part of the conversation, but it can't be where it ends. Payment is the absolute minimum. That means that she's not being robbed. But there's a whole other side of contextualizing that needs to happen. I don't know. I am not enough in the industry to have a really solid understanding of how things like payment for covers go. She certainly did receive compensation. Every time it's performed and recorded to CCLI, she'll make, for 2 cents, literally. But but I'm not sure how much further that goes or what happens when Leland saves it, for example. So that's a really good question, and I'm intrigued to learn more about that as I keep kind of following this path. The second question, how it changed. Yeah. So one thing I didn't touch on, it was so hard to put all of this into 2 minutes. One thing I didn't touch on that is a whole other presentation is that Leland added a whole new bridge and got rid of Sinatra's original bridge. And so that's a huge, I have some work to do in tracing how that bridge evolved. And I haven't done that as it wasn't part of this presentation, but I'm really intrigued to see what happens. Sinatra has a bridge that's kind of, you wipe away all tears and then the broken hearts, that's the theme. And then Leland added this bridge, which I wrote a blog post on this and used the text ironically. It's so good. Which is even when I can't see it, you're working. Even when I can't feel it, you're working. You never stop working, which is so good when you're covering someone else's song. And so there's definitely musical and linguistic difference there, as well as just instrumental differences. Also, Sinatra has a lot of kind of praying tongues interspersed throughout, and Leland's just not. So there's definitely musical differences. Sinatra has a lot of strings, which is really fun, and Leland has kind of that traditional American rock ensemble instrumentation. So yeah, there are definitely differences there. Thanks for those questions.
Other questions?
Thank you for your presentation. I was intrigued by the slide with the three circles on it. You mentioned there local communities. Can you reflect a bit on what actually is local communities? Does it exist as such?
Yeah, and that's really pointing to the issue with global song too as a term. It's so hard to kind of distill some of this into bite-sized chunks for understanding the big flow of movement here. So the issue I have with global song is that it totally centers North America as the home base, and everything else is a global song from outside of North America. And we, of course, I just finished a hymnal class, as we always rub against that, and trying to be attentive to it, everyone is. But it's just hard when the term kind of inherently centers North America. And so global communities in this case are communities that are outside of North America. It's a very imperfect kind of system and language and follows the language of global song in that sense in terms of dividing what's global and what's not. Interestingly, things like the Grammys are also considering the issue with world music, global music, all of these things and how they kind of center North America and recognizing that they're flawed. So in that case, it was kind of communities around the world, non-Euro-American communities in North America, and then white North American music industry, which is a very simplistic version for sure.
Other questions? Thank you so much, Anneli. Our final presenter today is Mykayla, and we welcome you in the presentation. Thank you. I want to mention before I begin as Lisa did that I do have a handout listed on the schedule for this event. It includes the lyrics to the hymn that I will be analyzing. I do have some stanzas quoted in the presentation, so it's really only if you want further context for what's being said up here. Since its emergence in the 17th century among German Protestants, pietism has been a subject of critical debate. In its earliest days, onlookers hurled insults at pietists and nearly accused them of heresy. More recently, Martin E. Marty has described the experiential basis of pietism as an instance of, quote, Christian retreat from responsibility, unquote. Mark R. Talbot laments that this inward experience of God, inherited from 17th century pietists, is highly subjective and, quote, can therefore lead Christians to agonize over whether they are saved, unquote. In light of both historic and contemporary criticisms, F. Ernest Stuffler has aptly concluded that pietism is, quote, one of the least understood movements in the history of Christianity. Perhaps for this reason, Roger E. Olson copies the critical approach often taken by his peers with an attempt to dispel 6 myths related to pietism, including the notion that, quote, pietism fosters emotional subjectivism so that it is antagonistic to the life of the mind, unquote. The hymn texts of Paul Gerhardt easily fall under such criticism, especially since they were favored by pietist leader Philip Jakob Spener, and engendered an affective experience which set pietism apart from the rest of religious life in the 17th century.
One must, of course, keep in mind that affective language and experience did not originate among pietists in this period. On the contrary, pietists inherited this affective impulse from earlier Christian movements and their leaders. But nevertheless, for my purposes, a deeper analysis of Gerhardt's hymn texts and the 17th century context within which they emerged suggests a nuanced relationship between affect and intellect that cannot be dismissed merely as an instance of history repeating itself. My research then draws upon affect theory and cognitive narratology to explore the affective trajectory of pietist hymnody. Using Aristotle's Fantasia belief harmony and its implications for social actions, I analyze one of Gerhardt's hymn texts entitled Consolation for Penitence, and conclude that affective language is employed for the purpose of inspiring rather than undermining intellectual reflection. In other words, affect and intellect exist in a symbiotic relationship that contributes to overall cognition and promotes a more hospitable view of the pietist movement. Before arriving at this conclusion, however, I gather several theological ideas advanced by pietists in the 17th century, namely new birth, sanctification, and the inner person, and juxtapose them with Aristotle's Fantasia belief binary. According to Dale Brown, the notion of new birth that circulated among 17th century pietists denotes a transformative process by which one is not only forgiven by God, but also changed by God. In an excerpt here from Schweiner's Pia Desideria, we find that the fruits of life that are known to us as good works proceed from the soul of this new man, suggesting that new birth exists in a cause and effect relationship with sanctification. Pietists identify the soul or the inner person as the locus of this new birth from which good works then emerge. Johann Arndt captured this process well in his influential work, True Christianity. Quote, true Christianity consists mainly in the exhibition of a true living faith, active in genuine godliness and the fruits of righteousness. It also shows how true repentance must proceed from the inmost center of the heart, that the heart, mind, and affections must be changed. Unquote. Although one must not gloss over Arndt's inclusion of the mind as one of the inner faculties that experiences new birth, this excerpt suggests that intellect is not the sole means through which one exercises faith. Instead, it exists in a symbiotic relationship with the affections that may be explained with reference to affect theory. Affect theory was only recently introduced as a formal academic discipline, but it is rooted in a long-standing awareness of the role of emotion in the process of reason that reaches as far back as Aristotle. For his part, Aristotle posited that affect and intellect are inextricably intertwined, leading to the development of a reciprocal Fantasia belief binary. According to Marshall Alcorn, Fantasia consists of, quote, a shifting synthesis of physiology, memory, imagistic representation, and affect, unquote. At one point, Alcorn likens Fantasia to the more familiar concept of an affectively conditioned response, such as a child who avoids fire after sustaining a burn. Fantasia thus interacts with rational thought in the same way that a child's rational conclusion about fire safety is determined by that previous affective experience. While Plato envisioned a dichotomous reason-emotion binary, the Fantasia belief binary nuances the relationship between affect and intellect, first by using a more expansive term, Fantasia, to speak of affective experience, as well as by emphasizing belief over reason when referring to intellect. Although, quote, beliefs have the feel of reason and are often claimed to be rational, quote, the Fantasia belief binary reveals that, quote, beliefs are sustained by affective attachments that cannot be fully supported by evidence and logic, unquote. If humans are driven largely by belief rather than reason, as Aristotle suggests, his Fantasia belief binary may then serve as a helpful frame of reference for the study of pietist hymnody. Indeed, Gerhardt's use of affective language to sustain the faith of his audience remarkably correlates with Aristotle's contention that rational thought is typically representative not of pure reason undefiled by the affections, but subjective belief that can only be altered or in this case reinforced by similarly subjective means, such as affective language. The Fantasia belief binary makes an implicit appearance in Dana Lacour's Mykayla's work when she asserts that humans, quote, not only feel for fictional characters, but also feel more acutely for them than for real counterparts, unquote, to such an extent that we would likely act on their behalf if we had some way of doing so. In fact, Mykayla applies Aristotle's Fantasia belief binary to a narrative context and incorporates action into the model as a demonstration of belief. Mykayla attributes this deeper-set empathy for fictional characters to the length and stylistically compelling language of a narrative. As opposed to a short and snappy news report, a narrative recounts a character's experiences in detail, such that the reader becomes attached to them and even empathizes with them over time. Patrick Hogan explores this personalization mechanism even further. Citing Laszlo Halas, he argues that the experiences of a fictional character are concretized when we relate them to our own past or present circumstances, thus merging fiction with reality and prompting an empathic response. For this reason, Mykayla suggests that the empathic impulse associated with fictional characters could be transferred to the real world to fuel social action. Social action may therefore be regarded as a third component of Aristotle's fantasia belief binary, in the same way that Pius understood good works of sanctification to arise from a transformed set of beliefs, that is, new birth, rooted in affective experience of the inner person. Although hymn texts are more concise than novels, Gerhardt's Consolation for Penitence is still akin to a narrative by describing a divine protagonist in affective terms. Furthermore, if all stanzas are set to music, it is possible that the degree of empathy instilled for a fictional character by a prosaic narrative could be matched for a divine character in a shorter musical setting of poetic text. Rooted in this assumption, we turn from a discussion of the theological and philosophical foundations of my argument to their application in the context of pietist belief. Consolation for Penitence consists of 12 stanzas that depict God as the protagonist through whom Gerhard appeals to the affections of his audience. For instance, the third stanza describes God as a compassionate father who is grieved by the sins of his children. Quote, God I as a father feels, he's afflicted by our ills. Our misfortune sorrow gives him, and our dying ever grieves him. By depicting God as a victim here, this stanza accomplishes the kind of personalization to which Hogan refers. As beings who are both responsible for and deeply familiar with the ills and sorrow felt by God, congregants can identify with God and are therefore compelled towards belief. Contrary to most fictional scenarios, however, this affective response may be translated into a tangible course of action that alleviates God's suffering. As the fourth stanza suggests, one must surrender their former self and experience new birth. Quote, truly, saith he, as I'm living, I the death of none desire, but that men themselves upgiving may be rescued from sin's mire. Unquote. New birth is therefore depicted as an efficacious action that may be taken on God's behalf. Rather than leaving one at a loss as to how to respond to the need of the divine character in this narrative, Gerhard used affective language to pull his audience into the narrative, assigning them a role much like that of the prodigal son in Luke 15. No longer is God, quote, afflicted by our ills. Rather, when a prodigal returns, God's heart then with rapture burns. As illustrated here, the fantasia belief binary is employed as a positive feedback mechanism. Affective language compels congregants to commit themselves to belief and good works, which then initiates another instance of empathic personalization as they indulge in the vision of God's heart burning for them. As Mykayla puts it, the affective response cultivated by this stanza, quote, blurs the line between factual and fictional circumstances, as well as the line between self and others, unquote. Prior to this point, consolation for penitence refers to sin as the source of separation between God and humanity. The second stanza speaks most explicitly of the poison of sin that has tainted humankind and distanced us from God. When contrasted with the call of God to turn to me, do good, which follows it, this account of sin highlights the essential link between new birth and sanctification. Simply put, if sin separates humanity from God, new birth in the presence of God is necessarily accompanied by a rejection of sin in exchange for good works. New birth and sanctification were therefore partnered in Gerhardt's imagination in the same way that action might be envisioned as an outgrowth of Aristotle's fantasia belief binary. The final stanza of Consolation for Penitence is clearly distinguished from earlier stanzas by its use of first-person language. For instance, congregants respond to the call of God that appeared in the second stanza by now expressing a personal desire to be near to God, quote, that I may embrace and love thee, nevermore to anger and move thee, unquote. This line has a culminating effect by assigning a real-life role to the listener, encouraging them to take real steps towards new birth and sanctification that are not confined to a fictional context. The effect would likely be compounded by repeated engagement with the text that invites ongoing participation in the narrative. Over time, a long-term connection with God forms and concretizes, especially with each iteration of the final stanza, which describes a sensory experience of tasting God's grace. Quote, of such wondrous love and favor, open wide the door to me. Everywhere, and I, my Savior, tasted be thy grace by me. Unquote. Even at the hymn's conclusion, then, an affective mode of persuasion serves as the basis of one's commitment to belief in good works that lie beyond the scope of the narrative. To conclude, I reiterate that pietist hymnody has often been criticized for its reliance on affective experience at the expense of intellect. While such criticism may appear to be warranted by Gerhardt's use of affective language to depict intimate encounters with God, a closer analysis of consolation for penitence through the lens of Aristotle's Fantasia Belief binary suggests otherwise. In contrast to Plato's reason-emotion binary, the Aristotelian model views affect as an essential counterpart to intellect that contributes to overall cognition, while L. Edward Phillips writes that, quote, the cognitive and emotive aspects of experience are two sides of one coin, unquote. I contend that cognition is an umbrella term consisting of both affective experience and intellectual reflection. This approach mitigates the risk of conflating cognition and intellect and relegating affect to an isolated or even inferior plane. When it comes to church music scholarship, then, my research makes an important contribution by reframing affective language as an indispensable tool for shaping belief, especially, although not exclusively, in the context of 17th century pietism. Notably, I have not considered in detail how one might respond to a text once it is set to music. While the hymn text does not readily allow for long-term affective engagement with the protagonist, the tune that accompanies the text may serve a compensatory function by harnessing the affections to a similar degree, albeit within a shorter period. For this reason, the role of music in sustaining the Fantasia Belief binary is a ripe area of future study. Indeed, my application of affect theory and cognitive narratology to 17th century pietism marks an integrative step towards a more hospitable view of this tradition that should inform future research in both historical and contemporary contexts. The reason-emotion binary, which has long dominated church music scholarship, has reached its breaking point. In its place stands a new model, Aristotle's Fantasia Belief binary, with the capacity to foster empathy not just between God and humans in a narrative context, but also in real-life scholarly engagement with the pietist movement as a whole.
Questions?
It's very helpful. Could you move us outside of 1750 pietism and maybe, I'm sorry if it's off the top of your head, but something 19th century gospel song or 21st century contemporary Christian that might apply this thinking?
Absolutely, yeah. To me, contemporary worship music is what immediately comes to mind, and that actually was in a previous draft of this presentation. It didn't make the cut. But I do think that especially, in the worship wars era, if we just go back a couple of decades, I think that's something that contemporary worship music was really critiqued for, was the affective quality. It became seen as really kind of fluffy and insignificant. And I think that this concept that I'm applying to pietist hymnody could be further applied to contemporary worship music, which then necessarily constitutes an embrace of the genre rather than a rejection of it. Yeah, so that would definitely be one that I would name. But gospel music as well, like 18th or 19th, 20th century, certainly has that same sort of quality. There's sort of a line that can be traced there. Other questions?
Speaking of that,
to that comment, but as you think through this idea of affective understanding, what kind of affective theology arises? And how do you, if you wouldn't mind articulating this idea of God as revealed in this way?
I guess to me, I would say, I mean, if we're speaking like just kind of personally about like how I understand theology and affective theology, the incarnation really forms a lot of how I understand God and God's relationship to humanity. And so to think that God took on all of the human person, that includes both affect and intellect. And so I think that then calls us to embrace both of those components in the music that we sing in church as well. I think that's how I would answer that. Questions?
I want to thank you all for coming today to the Emerging Scholars Forum. Thank you to our three wonderful presenters. And just to let you know, we will be deliberating this evening, and so I'll check with the powers that be when that will be announced, but at some point this week we will make an announcement of who the winner is. And so we look forward to that, and thank you all for coming. Have a great rest of the day.